afternoon. This is Professor David Weiss, speaking from New Jersey City University's Institute for Dispute Resolution. And once again, it's Connecting Bridges and Borders podcast programs on various subjects ranging from global business to global affairs, entrepreneurship and innovation, and of course, mediation. Today, we have an exciting and important conversation about diversity, both in the workplace and in education. And with us to speak about that is a good friend of mine, a coach actually to many of our teams at New Jersey City University's IBR that go to major competitions on mediation, both in Paris and Vienna, through large platforms that we do globally. He's also a professor of law. He teaches at Seton Hall Law School, as well as Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. And I want to welcome to the show today, Professor Maurice Robinson. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? How are you keeping safe and sane?
We're doing well. We're doing well. And the virtual world continues to let us advance our educational systems and help the growth of our students and continue to provide opportunities like this today to all of our listeners, both here and abroad. So, Professor Robinson, why don't we start off by just telling the world a little bit about you and what you do?
Well, like most ADR professionals, I wear a lot of different hats, but I think for the context of this conversation, as you mentioned, I am an adjunct law professor at a couple of law schools teaching ADR courses, as well as live client legal practicum with the Southern District of New York's court doing live federal representation and mediation for employment discrimination. I'm also a ADR professional in the New York City government. I do equity, diversity, and inclusion for them, serving as an EEO officer. In that space, I really try to use ADR as a mechanism for civil Gideon, as well as increasing access to justice. And I incorporate that in my teaching mechanism to really make sure that we have that same kind of diversity and access in our classrooms as we do want to have in our courtrooms.
Well, picking up on that tone, let's just jump right in on this. I think it's really important for our listeners to understand the importance of inclusion and what mediation means to inclusion. Why don't we start there? What does mediation inclusion mean to you?
Well, I think when you look at the legal environment as a whole, we are, as an industry and as a profession, one of the slowest to actually diversify. So there are small numbers when you talk about women, especially in positions of power, and minorities in position of power. And I think mediation is a vehicle we can use to kind of normalize or equalize that playing field for people. It's fresh, it's new, it's exciting. There's a lot of entry points that don't follow the traditional model that legal education would require. I also think for the client or for the person that has a conflict, it really gives them access points that they may not have traditionally had or understood in the court. We all know that there's legalese and there's process in court that's sometimes even difficult for people that have a formal legal education to understand. And mediation kind of knocks that down and takes it back to the bare bones with simple language, allowing people to have what's known as voice and choice in the process, instead of depending on people that they may not be able to afford or a legal education that they may not have had access to.
Well, this is really fascinating commentary. And I think let's break down each one a little bit. And maybe we can use the spectrum of where we are right now in this era of pandemic due to the COVID-19 situation. So let's kind of roll back in time. And this voice and choice and access to justice, we can use that as sort of our theme of discussion on diversity. Where did you see before the pandemic voice and choice in terms of its faults, as well as in terms of where it was starting to move for purposes of access to justice?
I think for the courts, we saw dockets that were exploding. The court was really getting slammed with cases and litigation, and that process didn't allow for people to access that litigation effectively. They didn't understand how to move through the courts, how to file cases, what needed to be done, how do you properly file the case so that it's not quickly dismissed. And so legitimate disputes were kind of thrown out the door. When you bring in ADR and mediation, it was a win-win-win for everyone. It was a win for the courts in that it got to reduce the dockets and allow the judges to really focus on those hard issues that they needed, that kind of robe and that impetus of justice to actually rule on. For the clients, it gave them an opportunity to have a conversation and a voice in the process, Typically in court, you have an attorney. The judge will only speak to the attorney. The attorneys only speak to each other. There's really no voice for the client to come in and say what they want and how they want to move, except in private chambers with their counsel. Mediation takes that away and allows them to really vent, allows them to have a say in what the resolution is going to be. And that we found made much more durable resolutions in the court. And then for us as attorneys, having these people actually have some say and input allowed us to step back and really resolve the conflict and do the papering of the conflict or the resolution once they were able to really fester out what are the real problems and issues here that we may not see from our legal training. Because for a lot of people, especially for access to justice, these are personal issues, especially when you deal with issues of discrimination or harassment.
So if we're looking at it from the prism of before the pandemic, and we're looking at the process that you so clearly defined for us and our listeners, what are some of the challenges that were being faced and currently are still being faced when you look at the stakeholders as they participate in this mediation process that you quote unquote show as a win-win for all? But where does diversity play and has currently been playing a role in this process?
Well, I think one way is, again, when you are navigating kind of the legal sphere and the legal forum, having a guide or a bridge to that so that you can understand language and process is really important. And that guide is typically going to be somebody that understands the court language, that has been trained in the court, but also understands your cultural language and is trained in how to communicate that effectively back to you. And that's where mediation and diversity has played the role in that you have these kind of cultural ambassadors that are ushering or moving people through the formal legal process in a way that they understand, that it makes sense to them, that it's culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive to that particular person. And you get to take that time and really focus on what this individual client needs at this particular moment and what remedies may be important outside of what remedies could be provided in the traditional court setting.
Well, this cultural aptitude that you're talking about, I think is really interesting. Let's explore that for a moment. So we're really looking at having two different skill sets. One is the proper formal training for whether it's an advocate or somebody who's a lawyer representing a party. But if we just sort of focus on that mediator role for a moment, from what I'm hearing you say, and please expand on this, the mediator needs to not only be properly trained in the process of mediation, but then it's also about having a proper pool of mediators that understand the cultural language, the cultural aptitude of the parties involved in the mediation. Is that something to comment on and to explore?
Absolutely. We call that cultural competency. So understanding that from the basic things of a handshake, where in a Western civilization, that's very normal, that's very everyday, everybody does it. But from other cultures, that may be very offensive or not allowed. And you need to know that going into that process because you could be offending somebody before you even begin. And I think with COVID especially, a lot of those things are changing. So the handshake is not as normal anymore. And how do we greet each other? How do we exchange in that? We're starting to see that shift that culturally competent mediators have always been aware of and always kind of been addressing before COVID came along. And that really just creates a safe space and environment where people feel welcome, they feel included, and they feel like they're willing, ready, and able and open to discuss their issues.
So when we look at this from where we are currently in the pandemic, certainly a lot of personal discoveries have been made about oneself, given the, and this is a global remark for all of us that have had to stay closer to home during this period of time. As a result of that, we've also had to perhaps change our behaviors, our lifestyles, things that we knew before this time. Where do you see the opportunities in improving these systems that were important and are important to solve both conflict and or even maybe not even solve conflict, but be part of the communication dialogue between parties, especially when it comes to the role of diversity?
Well, I think what's important is that the epidemic as it stands has really given us an opportunity to really examine our systems and where they lack, what the faults they may have. And I think one of the major faults that we found is really the access to those systems. And that looks from a cultural access, a cognitive access, to even physical access to these systems. So we're allowed to see that, okay, we've got some real problems here that we now have a great opportunity to address with the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion in doing that. You know, how do we give people access to the court system when they can't walk through the door anymore? And these are questions as a professional lawyer in employment and discrimination that I've kind of always thought about. Do you have an accessible ramp? Is the place where you're holding this meeting accessible for someone with a disability? Now I think we're overall looking at the whole systems to say, how accessible are our systems and how effective are they in reaching various communities, not just those what we call privileged communities that know how to use it, know how to access it, and can easily do it. And when we start to rebuild, we're able to now rebuild in a structure that includes more people, that is inclusive of more different types of people, and allows greater access for all people to come in and really use these services that we provide.
And I think that's a really important point here. It gives us an opportunity to do this and re-examine these systems. Let me push on you a little bit, Maurice. What are these systems? What would you define as some of these systems that need to be re-examined, given that we have an opportunity to do that re-examining and improve the overall diversity of those systems as they reshape and reform both currently and post, we'll say, the pandemic era?
Well, I think, you know, when you think about pipelining in this system, you know, how do we get to the point of being a lawyer and looking at the education? That's one of the systems there, the requirements of being an actual lawyer. How do you go and be able to represent yourself or others from your community in the court system? And that's, you know, a very old, very structured, very regimented system that's been in place. And now we're really changing that. How do we get students, number one, to the law school? How do we recruit? How do we get them through law school? We've went from the traditional classroom settings to now professors changing to virtual classrooms. And then how do we graduate them, have them sit for the bar in the United States? And then how do they begin their practice and their learning? You know, we are seeing right now, because of COVID, virtual summer internship opportunities. We're seeing virtual teaching. And those kind of systems have really looked at what we call in academia the hidden curriculum. The things you need to know in order to get through law school, the things you should have known in order to get through law school, that's kind of passed, not in the traditional sense of in the classroom, but in the hallways before you go to classroom. That's that other student telling you, if you're going to Professor Robinson's ADR class, you better read, you know, Getting to Yes, Getting Past No, because that's just going to be a seminal text, whether he assigns it or not. And we're seeing that, okay, how does that exchange occur now that we're not actually physically in that space? And who has access to that knowledge, and how is that knowledge shared, and what impact does it have? And then also looking at things like virtual learning. Who has access to computers? Who has access to internet? How do we reach people and give them opportunities to get this education in a new and exciting way that is engaging to them, but also addresses maybe their learning modality that they may have? Some people are visual, some people are auditory, making sure that as professors, we are really equity minded in our teaching and making sure we're reaching everybody in the different kind of ways that they learn. This really, COVID has, for me personally, made me really stop and take a look at not just my class that I want to teach, but each student that's in that class, and how do I reach them and make sure that they are geared for success? As we increase that pipeline, we have more diversity and equity in ways that we can reach people. I heard about a summer program that's fully virtual that is now allowing students that couldn't afford to maybe summer in a New York or a New Jersey area to have the opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily have pre-COVID.
That's really interesting, because that gets to how we look at and explore not only resource allocation, but then also some of the comments that you made about how technology can contribute towards a more balanced diversity within the system itself of education. Now, I know that you're a professor that focuses in the law schools and certainly as an attorney. Where do you see improvements that can be made in other areas of the university or higher education, such as where the Institute for Dispute Resolution is located in a business school that doesn't have a law school affiliated with it, even within its university structure, in this discussion?
Well, I think, again, this is an opportunity for partnership, for cross-cultural exchanging that can occur between business students and law students and other entities, because at the end of the day, the business students are going to become the law students' clients. And because we are now not stuck in this actual physical building, in this physical classroom, we can engage more cross-culturally and cross-institutional wise with these other entities using resources that now may be digital and made available to a larger set of people that many of us kind of siloed and kept to ourselves before COVID. What we've found is that with COVID, a lot of people have been sharing best practices, sharing resources that they ordinarily would have kind of kept to themselves or honed in just for them because that was their specialty, that's their thing. People are really sharing and engaging and coming together as an education community as a whole, not as just siloed universities and institutions.
And that's an optimistic perspective, and potentially also addresses, when we say where are we going in the future on the educational part of the system in general. How do we address the hard question in the room, which is the status quo, or these older institutions in whether it's in law firms or in the provider system, or even in the corporate culture, and of course in government, both here and abroad, in order to get them to this new table, this new future? What would you?
Well, I think COVID addressed that for us. So there is no status quo anymore. And one of the things I think in government that was really hard pressed was the idea of telework and telecommuting. And there was, before COVID, a lot of hard line no, and now they've done it. They've engaged in it. So you can't kind of revert back to, well, we don't do telecommute, it's not feasible, because you've done it for several months and now you have an actual example of it being feasible, and in some instances, quite successful. I think also when we think about returning after COVID and what that looks like, a lot of that status quo has been broken down. We've done it because that's the way we've always done it. And now we've had to redo it a different way. We've had to engage in a different way. And we see that there is opportunity to change, and not only change to be adaptable, but change to be even more efficient and more effective in the work that we do, saving resources. I think the fact that resources are going to be reduced for a lot of entities, a lot of companies, a lot of institutions, and they're going to have to look for new and different ways. Even when they want to go back to the old way, they're not going to be able to afford to go back to the old way.
So I'm sorry, go ahead, Professor, please.
I think also when you look at it from a diversity, equity, and inclusion space, one of the things I always say is that when you invite diversity into the door, it is going to fundamentally change you. So the idea is not just getting different and new people in the door, but it's keeping them there and making that feel a safe space for them. And I think COVID is, how do we bring people back into the workplace, back into these buildings and institutions, and makes them feel safe and included? And that's going to open the sphere and allow diversity, equity, and inclusion to be a part of your crisis management team now. That's going to be a part of your reopening and reentry teams. You see a lot of mayors building these kind of cabinets that have diversity and inclusion as a focus in the actual planning and structuring of how we move forward.
And these are exciting times, because I think one of the things I'm thinking of, or the word that I'm thinking of as you're talking, is the opportunity for people to change their behavior, whether that's their cultural bias behavior or how they sort of viewed the world through the communities that they grew up in. If we change their behavior, would you consider this to be a great opportunity because obviously changing the behavior can go in one way or another, but this is an opportunity for behavior to really get aligned with a new era of opportunities, ideas, collaboration, and diversity. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's a very fair statement. How we engage and interact with each other as a community, as a nation, as a global world has significantly shifted since COVID. You've seen the exchange of resources from countries. You've seen the exchange of technology, of knowledge, of information happening. And I think that that is only going to increase as we foster that kind of global looking, that global diversity, that global inclusion of people, thoughts, and ideas across the board. It also has taken us from a me movement to an us. Self-isolation in itself is not really about you, but it's about protecting others. And that's not a thought process, especially in the United States, that we've generally had. It's been about protecting yourself first and then others. But now we have this collective idea.
And given that collective idea, if you were to leave our listeners with some parting thoughts, things to think about, what would be some of the some message you would like them to sort of chew on? And our audience, of course, is here and abroad, so know that even on a cultural level, they may not understand the American way of life, but they certainly understand that we're a global community.
Well, I'd leave you with a couple of things that I think I've drawn from mediation in general. And that's number one, be accessible. Allow as many people in as possible. I always say, you know, when somebody is coming to the table, they're not asking for you to give up your seat for them to be there. They're asking for you to make room so they can sit down as well and exchange those ideas. The more ideas at the table, the more minds, the more diversity in thought, the more cultural, demographic, and cognitive diversity that you have, the better results. And that's been studied by several institutions to find the ROI on diversity, equity, and inclusion, the return on investment, yields better profits, better technology, better innovation across the board. So,
and I would hope better quality of life, right? Better
quality of life. When you're also being accessible, you know, don't look at those easy, low-hanging fruit accessibility issues. Look at the larger issues, especially with the use of technology. Are we looking at the disabled community? Are we looking at access to the technology that we're providing and making sure that it's accessible to all people who want to engage and partake, not just those that have the privilege or resources to be able to access that?
That is fantastic. I was going to just say to you, Professor, that one of my next questions is going to be your opinion on technology. So please continue. That's fantastic that you were also thinking about the same ideals in terms of how technology will play a part in this diversification.
Absolutely. I think mediation teaches us to be flexible and open, and that's where we're going to have to be, and coming back and doing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the way that we teach, in the way that we engage, in the way that we work. And I think the main aspects of that you really should think about is, what are my policies? Do I have flexible policies? Am I thinking about alternative ways to engage people? Am I thinking about alternative ways that I'm assessing the work performance, for instance, of people, or the educational result that I'm looking for, where we traditionally in the education sphere use things like tests and assignments. Those have significantly changed because you're not able to engage and interact or use those same modalities. We're changing the modalities that we use. So making sure that we're flexible and open to the new technology that may be available that's on the forefront. And then I think also being what I call identity conscious. You know, we've lived in a race neutral kind of world for a while where I don't see color has been famous phrases a lot of people have used. I think you have to see kind of people's cultural differences, acknowledge them and accept them, and understand that the way people move in the world is impacted by their social identity. And in that environment, and I think especially at this particular moment, when you're looking at those things, there's several ways to incorporate the acknowledgement of that and to make sure we're safeguarding against some of the practices that may have excluded people in the past. So looking at the microaggressions that may have occurred, considering, you know, culturally relevant material. Are you just giving something that's, you know, in our case right now, very US centric, or are you thinking globally and providing examples across the world or across cultures or across demographics to include much more a wider base? And then I think you have to be aware of the current situation and the impact it is having on different communities, because COVID is affecting a lot of different communities in very different kinds of ways. And really being proactive and intrusive and checking in with either your students or your employees to see how things are going, to make sure that their structure is there and that there is some type of accountability in the structure that you're creating. That people can come back and let you know, hey, this is working really well, or this isn't working very well. And they have a space and a process in order to give you kind of that constructive feedback and exchange, so that then you can circle back and start to be inclusive, flexible and adaptive, identity conscious all over again to make sure you're addressing it.
I love your parting remarks. I think that they are so resilient and so important, because I'll use a phrase that we use in the mediation community. It's one thing to listen, it's another to be active listening. And I think that the active listening of the last several remarks you made, I hope my listeners really take heart to this, because so many people want to do right, but they're sometimes just listening. And they're not active listening to understand that you need to be part of a process, not just give to the process. And the process needs to be inclusive, not just one-sided directed. And I think that is a wonderful way to wrap up our discussion today on diversity, its future in both education and in mediation, and gives our listeners something to chew on and to think about. And I want to thank you, Professor, for taking your valuable time today to educate our listeners a little bit about what you do and about this particular and very important topic, especially given the era that we're in and the opportunities we have to innovate and to change things and move humanity forward in a more positive fashion. So once again, this is Professor David Weiss, speaking from the New Jersey City University's Institute for Dispute Resolution. I want to thank Professor Maurice Robinson. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having us, David, and thanks for having these crucial conversations. This is part of that process and step in moving forward and making sure that we share knowledge and information in a global sense.
And from Connecting Bridges and Borders podcast series, once again, I bid adieu until our next show. Global business, global affairs, and of course, mediation, innovation, and entrepreneurship, the pedestals of moving and advancing humanity forward. Until next time, be safe, be well, take care.